recording now. Here we go. Chapter 14, Liberating Marriage and Partnership. When contemporary feminist movement was at its peak, the institution of marriage was harshly critiqued. The entrance of many heterosexual women into the movement had been sparked by male domination in intimate relationships, particularly long-time marriages where gender inequity was the norm. From the onset, the movement challenged the double standard in relationship to sexuality, which condemned females who were not virgins or faithful lovers and spouses, while allowing men the space to do whatever they desired sexually and have their behavior condoned. The sexual liberation movement strengthened feminist critique of marriage, especially the demand for safe, affordable birth control. Early on, feminist activists focused so much attention on private bonds and domestic relationships because it was in those circumstances that women of all classes and races felt the brunt of male domination, whether from patriarchal parents or spouses. A woman might assertively challenge a sexist male boss or strangers' attempt to dominate her, then go home and submit to her partner. Contemporary feminists, both those heterosexual women who had come from long-time marriages and lesbian allies in struggle, critiqued marriage as yet another form of sexual slavery. They highlighted the way traditionally sexist bonds led to marriages where elements of intimacy, care, and respect were sacrificed so that men could be on top, could be patriarchs ruling the roost. Early on, many feminist women were pessimistic about men changing. Some heterosexual women decided that they would choose celibacy or lesbianism over seeking after unequal relationships with sexist men. Others saw sexual monogamy with men as reinforcing the idea that the female body was property belonging to the individual male she was bonded with. We chose non-monogamous relationships and often refused to marry. We believed living with a male partner without state-sanctioned marriage within patriarchal society helped men maintain a healthy respect for female autonomy. Feminists advocated demanding an end to sexual slavery and called attention to the prevalence of marital rape, while at the same time championing the rights of women to express sexual desire, initiate sexual interaction, and be sexually fulfilled. There were many heterosexual men who embraced feminist thinking precisely because they were unfulfilled sexually in relationships with partners who were not interested in sex because they had been taught virtuous women were not sexually active. These men were grateful to feminist movement for offering a liberatory sexual paradigm for female mates because it ensured that they would have a more fulfilling sex life. By challenging the notion that a woman's virtue was determined by her sexual practice, feminist thinkers not only took away the stigma attached to not being a virgin, they placed female sexual well-being on an equal par with that of men. Urging women to no longer pretend that they were sexually fulfilled when this was not the case, feminist movement threatened to expose male sexual shortcomings. To defuse this threat, sexist men continually insisted that most feminists were lesbians, or that all any feminist woman needed was a good fuck to put her back in her place. In actuality, feminist rebellion exposed the fact that many women were not having satisfying sex with men in patriarchal relationships. In relationship to intimate bonds, most men were more willing to embrace feminist changes in female sexuality, which led women to be more sexually active than those changes which demanded of men a change in their sexual behavior. The absence of sexual foreplay was a much discussed issue when feminist agendas first focused on heterosexuality. Straight women were tired of male sexual coercion and the lack of concern with female pleasure. Feminist focus on sexual pleasure gave women the language to critique and challenge male sexual behavior. When it came to sexual freedom, women made great strides. The critique of monogamy has been forgotten as the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases has made it more difficult for females to choose sexual promiscuity. The prevalence of life-threatening diseases like AIDS, which tend to be more easily transmitted male to female, in a patriarchal culture where men are encouraged to lie to women, have made it harder for heterosexual women to choose a variety of partners. Clearly, when the emphasis is on monogamy in heterosexual bonds within patriarchy, it is often harder for couples to break with sexist paradigms. Concurrently, within patriarchy, many individual feminist women found that non monogamous relationships often simply gave men more power while undermining women. While women will freely choose to have sex with a man who is partnered with another woman, men will often choose men will often show no sexual interest in a woman who is partnered, or they will continually concede power to the male the woman is partnered with, even going so far as to seek his approval of their involvement. Despite these difficulties, women having the freedom to be non monogamous, whether we exercise that freedom or not, continues to disrupt and challenge the notion that the female body belongs to men. Like all the positive changes produced by feminist critique of sexist notions of sexual pleasure, it has helped create a world where women and men can have more satisfying sexual relationships. At first, it appeared that changes in the nature of sexual bonds would lead to other changes in domestic relationships, that men would also do an equal share of household chores and child care. Nowadays, so many males acknowledge that they should do household chores, whether they actually do them or not, that young women see no need to make sharing chores an issue. They just accept this as a norm. Of course, the reality is that it has never become the norm, that for the most part, women still do most of the housework and child care. Overall, men were more willing to accept and affirm equality in the bedroom than to accept equality around housework and child care. Not surprisingly, as individual women gained in class power, many women deal with inequity by hiring caretakers to do the tasks neither they nor male partners want to perform. Yet, when a heterosexual couple pays help to do the tasks sexist thinking defines as female, it is usually the woman who employs the help and oversees this work. More than any factor, the feminist critique of mothering as the sole satisfying purpose of a woman's life changed the nature of marriage and long-time partnerships. Once a woman's worth was no longer determined by whether or not she birthed and raised children, it was possible for a two-career couple who wanted to remain childless to envision a peer marriage, a relationship between equals. The absence of children made it easier to be peers simply because the way in which patriarchal society automatically assumes certain tasks will be done by mothers almost always makes it harder for women to achieve gender equity around childcare. For example, it is very telling that in the wake of feminist movement, the patriarchal medical establishment, which had previously downplayed breastfeeding, suddenly began to be not only positive about breastfeeding, but insistent. This is just one aspect of child rearing that automatically places more responsibility on the birthing female, whether she is heterosexual or lesbian. Certainly, many women in relationships with males often found that having a newborn baby plummeted their relationships back into more sexist defined roles. However, when couples work hard to maintain equity in all spheres, especially childcare, it can be the reality. The key issue, though, is working hard, and most men have not chosen to work hard at childcare. Positively feminist interventions called attention to the value and importance of male parenting both in regards to the well-being of children and gender equity. When males participate equally in parenting, relationships between women and men are better, whether the two parents are married or live together or separately. Because of feminist movement, more men do more parenting than ever before, yet we have not achieved even a semblance of gender equity. And we know that this equal participation makes parenting a more positive and fulfilling experience for all parties involved. Of course, the demands of work often create the obstacles to more participation in childcare by working parents, especially men. Until we see major changes in the way work is structured time-wise, we will not live in a world where life is designed to allow men the time and space to parent. In that world, men might be more eager to parent. But until then, many working males who are overtired and underpaid will all too willingly accept a woman doing all the childcare, even if she is overtired and underpaid. The world of work within white supremacist capitalist patriarchy has made it harder for women to parent fully. Indeed, this reality is leading women who might choose a career to stay home. Rather than sexist thinking about male domination becoming the factor which takes women out of the workforce and puts them back in the home, it is the fear that we are raising a society of quote unquote parentless children. Many women find competitive careerism leaves little time for nurturing, loving relationships. The fact that no one talks about men leaving work to be full-time parents shows the extent to which sexist thinking about roles prevails. Most people in our society still believe women are better at raising children than men. To a grave extent, women, who on one hand critiqued motherhood but on the other hand also enjoyed the special status and privileges it gave them, especially when it came to parent-child bonding, were not as willing to relinquish pride of place in parenting to men as feminist thinkers hoped. Individual feminist thinkers who critiqued biological determinism in every other area often embraced it when it came to the issue of mothering. They were not able to fully embrace the notion that fathers are just as important as mothers and can parent just as well. These contradictions, along with the predominance of sexist thinking, have undermined the feminist demand for gender equity when it comes to childcare. Nowadays, mass media continually bombards us with the message that marriage has made a comeback. Marriage never went out of fashion. Often, when people proclaim that it is making a comeback, what they really mean is that more sexist defined notions of marriage are, quote unquote, in again. This fact is troubling to the feminist movement because it is just as clear today as it was yesterday that marriages built on a sexist foundation are likely to be deeply troubled and rarely last. Traditionally, sexist marriages are more and more in vogue, and while they tend to breed the seeds of misery and dissatisfaction that served as a catalyst for feminist rebellion in domestic relationships, the factor that breaks with tradition is that these bonds are often severed quickly. Folks marry young and divorce young. Patriarchal male domination in marriage and partnerships has been the primary force creating breakups and divorces in our society. All recent studies of successful marriages show that gender equity creates a context where each member of the couple is likely to be affirmed. This affirmation creates greater happiness, and even if the marriage does not last forever, the peer friendship that has been the foundation of the bond continues. Significantly, in future feminist movement, we will spend less time critiquing patriarchal marriage bonds and expend more effort showing alternatives, showing the value of peer relationships which are founded on principles of equality, respect, and the belief that mutual satisfaction and growth are needed for partnerships to be fulfilling and lasting. Okay. Thanks, Turb. Thanks, Che. What's up, friends? I find Hooks' writing to be quite straightforward in a lot of ways, so there's not as much for me to say in between chapters. I especially don't want to patronize y'all with like analysis that's not really analysis, but just like summarizing things. That being said, it's so interesting because now in the age of trad wives and trad marriages and, you know, people talking about certain fascist social and cultural elements kind of seeming to reemerge in like popular culture today, despite this idea that we're so woke, kind of speak to this constant reemerging of these things, especially like, yeah, in times of economic trouble and despair and people turning to fascism more and more. Not just in terms of fascism as an idea, but in terms of fascism more ardently showing its face as imperialism becomes more and more tricky and difficult for it to manage. Getting some emails. Y'all remind me I have to send an email when the stream is over. Chapter 15. A Feminist Sexual Politic, an Ethics of Mutual Freedom. Before feminist movement, before sexual liberation, most women found it difficult, if not downright impossible, to assert healthy sexual agency. Sexist thinking taught to females from birth on had made it clear that the domain of sexual desire and sexual pleasure was always and only male, that only a female of little or no virtue would claim that only a female of little or no virtue would lay claim to sexual need or sexual hunger. Divided by sexist thinking into the roles of Madonnas or whores, females had no basis on which to construct a healthy sexual self. Luckily, feminist movement immediately challenged sexist sexual stereotypes. It helped that this challenge came at a time in our nation's history where dependable birth control was made accessible to all. Before dependable birth control, female sexual self-assertion could always lead to the punishment, quote unquote, of unwanted pregnancy and the dangers of illegal abortion. We have not amassed enough testimony to let the world know the sexual pathologies and horrors women endured prior to the existence of dependable birth control. It evokes fear within me just to imagine a world where every time a female is sexual, she risks being impregnated. To imagine a world where men want sex and women fear it. In such a world, a desiring woman might find the intersection of her desire and her fear. We have not amassed enough testimony telling us what women did to ward off male sexual advances, how they coped with ongoing marital rape, how they coped with risking death to deal with unwanted pregnancies. We do know that the world of female sexuality was forever changed by the coming of feminist sexual revolution. For those of us who had witnessed the sexual pain and bitterness of our mothers, their out-and-out fear and hatred of sexuality coming into a movement just as we were becoming more sexual, that promised us freedom, pleasure, and delight was awesome. Nowadays, females face so few obstacles inhibiting their expression of sexual desire that our culture risks burying the historical memory of patriarchal assault on women's bodies and sexuality. In that place of forgetfulness, efforts to make abortion illegal can focus on the issue of whether or not a life is being taken without ever bringing into the discussion the devastating effects ending legal abortion would have on female sexuality. We still live among generations of women who have never known sexual pleasure, women for whom sex has only ever meant loss, threat, danger, annihilation. Female sexual freedom requires dependable, safe birth control. Without it, females cannot exercise full control of the outcome of sexual activity. But female sexual freedom also requires knowledge of one's body and understanding of the meaning of sexual integrity. Early feminist activism around sexuality focused so much attention on just the politics of granting females the rights to be sexual whenever we wanted to be, with whomever we wanted to be sexual with, that there was little feminist education for critical consciousness, teaching us how to respect our bodies in an anti-sexist way, teaching us what liberatory sex might look like. In the late 60s and early 70s, females were often encouraged to make synonymous sexual freedom and sexual promiscuity. In those days, and to some extent in the present, most heterosexual men saw and see a sexually liberated female as the one who would be or will be sexual with the least amount of fuss, i.e., asserting no demands, particularly emotional ones. And a large number of heterosexual feminists had the same misguided notions because they were patterning their behavior on the model provided by patriarchal males. However, it did not take women long to realize that sexual promiscuity and sexual liberation were not one and the same. When feminist movement was hot, quote unquote, radical lesbian activists constantly demanded that straight women reconsider their bonds with men, raising the question of whether or not it was possible for women to ever have a liberated heterosexual experience within a patriarchal context. This interrogation was useful for the movement. It not only forced straight women to engage in ongoing critical vigilance about heterosexual practice, it highlighted lesbians in ways that positively exposed their strength while also revealing weaknesses. I don't know why I said that like that. Weaknesses. Individual women who moved from having relationships with men to choosing women because they were seduced by the popular slogan, "Feminism is the theory, lesbianism the practice," soon found that these relationships were as emotionally demanding and as fraught with difficulties as any other. The degree to which lesbian partnership was as good as or better than heterosexual bonds was usually determined not by both parties being of the same sex, but by the extent of their commitment to breaking with notions of romance and partnership informed by a culture of domination's sadomasochistic assumption that in every relationship there is a dominant and a submissive party. Sexual promiscuity among lesbians could no more be equated with sexual liberation than it could be in heterosexual practice. Irrespective of their sexual preference, women who suffered emotionally by equating the two were disillusioned about sex. And given the connection between male domination and sexual violence, it is not surprising that women who had been involved with men were often the most vocal about their sexual unhappiness. The consequence of this disillusionment with the dream of sexual freedom was that many individual feminist thinkers either came away from coping with these experiences and or the negative fallout a female friend or comrade faced, harboring repressed resentment about all sexual activity, especially sexual contact with men. Radical lesbians who had once been the lone voices calling women to account for sleeping with the enemy, quote unquote, were now joined by heterosexual women who were choosing same-sex bonds because they were utterly disillusioned with men. Suddenly, the discourse on sexuality, particularly all discussion of intercourse that emerged, made it seem that all coitus was sexual coercion, that any penetration of the female by the male was rape. For a time, these theories and the individual charismatic women who spread the news had a deep impact on the consciousness of young women who were struggling to establish new and different sexual identities. Many of these young women ended up choosing bisexual practice or choosing relationships with men, where it was agreed that the female partner would determine the nature of all sexual encounter. However, masses of young females simply turned away from feminist thinking, and in this turning found their way back to outmoded sexist notions of sexual freedom and embraced them, at times with a vengeance. No wonder then that the contradictions and conflicts arising as a consequence of the tensions between sexual pleasure and danger, sexual freedom and bondage, provided the seductive proving ground for sexual sadomasochism. Ultimately, feminist interrogations of sexuality were all tied to a question of power. No matter how much feminist thinkers talked about equality, when it came to sexual desire and the enactment of sexual passion, the dynamics of power and powerlessness evoked in the sexual arena disrupted simplistic notions of oppressor and oppressed. Nothing challenged the grounds of feminist critique of heterosexual practice more than the revelation that feminist lesbians engaged in sexual sadomasochism, a world of tops and bottoms wherein positions of powerful and powerless were deemed acceptable. Practically, all radical feminist discussion of sexuality ceased when women within the movement began to fight over the issue of whether or not one could be a liberated woman, whether lesbian or heterosexual, and engage in the practice of sexual sadomasochism. Tied to this issue were differences of opinion about the meaning and significance of patriarchal pornography. Faced with issues powerful enough to divide and disrupt the movement, by the late 80s, most radical feminist dialogues about sexuality were no longer public. They took place privately. Talking about sexuality publicly had devastated the movement. Publicly, the feminist women who continued to talk the most about sexuality tended to be conservative, at times puritanical and anti-sex. The movement had been radically changed, moving from being a site where female sexual liberation had been called for and celebrated to a site where public discussions of sexuality focused more on sexual violence and victimization. Mainstream aging feminist individual women who had once been the great champions of female sexual freedom for the most part began to talk about sexual pleasure as unimportant, valorizing celibacy. Increasingly, women who speak and write openly about sexual desire and practice tend to dismiss or distance themselves from feminist sexual politics. And more than ever, the feminist movement is seen primarily as anti-sex. Visionary feminist discourse on sexual passion and pleasure has been pushed into the background, ignored by almost everyone. In its place, females and males continue to rely on patriarchal models of sexual freedom. Despite sexual revolution and feminist movement, we know that many heterosexual females have sex only because males want them to. That young homosexuals, male and female, still have no public or private supportive environment that affirms their sexual preference. That the sexist iconography of Madonna or whore continues to claim the erotic imagination of females and males. That patriarchal pornography now permeates every aspect of mass media. That unwanted pregnancy is on the increase. That teens are having often unsatisfying and unsafe sex. That in many long-time marriages and partnerships, whether same-sex or heterosexual, women are having no sex. All these facts call attention to the need for renewed feminist dialogue about sexuality. We still need to know what liberatory sexual practice looks like. Fundamentally, mutual respect is essential to liberatory sexual practice, and the conviction that sexual pleasure and fulfillment is best attained in a circumstance of choice and consensual agreement. Within patriarchal society, men and women cannot know sustained heterosexual bliss unless both parties have divested of their sexist thinking. Many women and men still consider male sexual performance to be determined solely by whether or not the penis is hard and erections are maintained. This notion of male performance is tied to sexist thinking. While men must let go of the sexist assumption that female sexuality exists to serve and satisfy their needs, many women must also let go a fixation on penetration. During the heyday of sexual liberation and contemporary feminist movement, women found that men were often willing to accept equality in every sphere except sexuality. In the bedroom, many men want a sexually desiring woman eager to give and share pleasure, but ultimately they did not surrender the sexist assumption that her sexual performance, i.e., whether or not she wanted to be sexual, should be determined by their desire. While it was fun to do it with willing, excited, liberated females, it was not fun when those females declared that they wanted a space not to be sexual. Often when that happened, heterosexual men made it clear that they would need to look elsewhere for sexual release, an action which reinforced the reality of continued allegiance to a sexist paradigm of ownership in the female body, as well as their holding to the notion that any female body would suffice. In a liberatory heterosexual or homosexual relationships, both parties should be free to determine when and how frequently they want to be sexual without fear of punishment. Until all men cease to believe that someone other than themselves is required to respond to their sexual needs, demanding sexual subordination of partners will continue. A truly liberatory feminist sexual politic will always make the assertion of female sexual agency central. That agency cannot come into being when females believe their sexual bodies must always stand in the service of something else. Often, professional prostitutes and women in everyday life hold up their free exchange of pussy for goods and services as an indication that they are liberated. They refuse to acknowledge the fact that whenever a woman prostitutes her body because she cannot satisfy material needs in other ways, she risks forfeiting that space of sexual integrity where she controls her body. Masses of heterosexual women remain unable to let go of the sexist assumption that their sexuality must always be sought after by men to have meaning and value. To do so, they must believe that same-sex sexual encounters, self-pleasuring, and celibacy are as vital and life-enhancing as sexual intercourse with men within patriarchal culture. Aging females, many of whom once advocated feminist change, often find that they must subscribe to sexist notions of femininity and sexual desirability in order to have any sexual contact with men whom they fear will trade them in for a younger model. To some extent, then, radical feminist thinkers were right years ago when they suggested that women would only be truly sexually liberated when we arrived at a place where we could see ourselves having sexual value and agency, irrespective of whether or not we were the objects of male desire. Again, we need feminist theory to show us how this sexual feeling and identity expresses itself within the context of a society that remains deeply patriarchal. Despite the limitations of feminist discourse on sexuality, feminist politics is still the only movement for social justice that offers a vision of mutual well being as a consequence of its theory and practice. We need an erotics of being that is founded on the principle that we have a right to express sexual desire as the spirit moves us, and to find in sexual pleasure a life-affirming ethos. Erotic connection calls us away from isolation and alienation into community. In a world where positive expressions of sexual longing connect us, we will all be free to choose those sexual practices which affirm and nurture our growth. Those practices may range from choosing promiscuity or celibacy, from embracing one specific sexual identity and preference, or choosing a roaming, uncharted desire that is kindled only by interaction and engagement with specific individuals with whom we feel the spark of erotic recognition, no matter their sex, race, class, or even their sexual preference. Radical feminist dialogues about sexuality must surface so that the movement towards sexual freedom can begin again. Yeah. So all I'll say there is that that's a very relevant chapter, right? Tackling subjects, especially with regards to abortion, and with regards to conversations people are having now about the 4B movement, and a type of sex strike or a type of political lesbianism, choosing to be with women only, choosing to reject heterosexual relationships with men. That Bell Hooks is talking about these subjects years and years before, and I get a sense that in some cases some of her thoughts might be controversial with some of today's feminist thinkers, but I get a sense too that she reaches an important ground mutually in terms of reinforcing what is the most important thing, which is each person's ability to speak for themselves sexually and to demand what they need sexually, to be respected for that. And the fact that abortion rights recenters the conversation on women being able to have actual control over their lives, over their, over their bodies. And we appear to be moving into a landscape in which that's going to be challenged, perhaps as harshly as ever. So chapter 16, Lesbianism and Feminism. Sometimes it's hard to know which came first, the movement for women's liberation or sexual liberation. For some activists, they happened at the same time, blending into one another. This was certainly true for many of the bisexual and lesbian women who were part of the first contemporary feminist vanguard. These women were not led to feminism because they were lesbian. Masses of lesbians were not into politics, were conservative, and had no desire to do anything radical. The lesbians and the bisexual women who helped form the women's liberation vanguard were led to feminism because they were already engaged in left politics, pushing against fixed boundaries of class, race, and sexuality. Women's liberation had already been an issue they had claimed psychologically, rebelling against traditional notions of gender and desire. Simply being lesbian does not make one a feminist, any more than being lesbian makes one political. Being a member of an exploited group does not make anyone more inclined to resist. If it did, all women, and that includes every lesbian on the planet, would have wanted to participate in the women's movement. Experience coupled with awareness and choice are the factors that usually lead women into leftist politics. Having done so much of the menial tasks, as well as the behind-the-scenes radical thinking in socialist circles and in the civil rights and militant Black Power movements, individual radical women from various walks of life were ready to get justice for themselves. They were ready for feminist movement. And among the most ready, the truly visionary and courageous were and are many lesbian women. I came to feminism before I had my first sexual experience. I was a teenager. Before I knew anything about women's rights, I knew about homosexuality. In the narrow-minded world of Southern religious fundamentalism, of racial apartheid, in our Black community, gay people were known and often had special status. Often they were men with class power. Homosexuality among men was more accepted than lesbianism. The lesbians in our small, segregated black community were usually married, yet they knew who they really were, and they let their real selves be known behind closed doors at secret juke joints and parties. One of the women accused of being lesbian chose to mentor me. A professional woman, a reader, a thinker, a party girl, she was a woman I admired. When my father complained about our bonding on the basis that she was funny, quote unquote, Mama protested, insisting that folks had a right to be who they are. When the gay man who lived across the street from us was cruelly teased and taunted by teenage boys, Mama was there protesting, telling us that he was a responsible, caring man, that we should respect and love him. I was an advocate for gay rights long before I knew the word feminism. My family feared I was lesbian long before they worried that I would never marry. And I was already on my way to being a true freak because I knew I would always choose to go where my blood beats, in any and all directions. When I wrote my first book, Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism, I had already been engaged in feminist movement which included straight, bisexual, and out gay women. We were young, and in those days there was pressure on some of us to prove we were really radically down with the movement by sharing our politics and our bodies with women. The lesson everybody learned in those days was that transgressive sexual practice did not make one politically progressive. When my first book came out and I was attacked by individual black lesbian women, I was stunned. I was accused of being homophobic because there was no discussion of lesbianism in my book. That absence was not an indication of homophobia. I did not talk about sexuality in the book. I was not ready. I did not know enough. And had I known more, I would have stated that so no one would have been able to label me homophobic. What knowing powerful, caring lesbians taught me as a girl, a lesson that has continued, is that women do not need to depend on men for our well-being and our happiness, not even our sexual bliss. This knowledge opened up a world of possibility for women. It offered choice and options. We will never know how many millions of women stay in relationships with dominating sexist males simply because they cannot imagine a life where they can be happy without men, whether they are satisfied sexually and emotionally with the men in their life or not. If any female feels she needs anything beyond herself to legitimate and validate her existence, she is already giving away her power to be self-defining, her agency. Lesbian women inspired me from childhood on to claim the space of my own self-definition. This is the special wisdom radical lesbian thinkers brought to feminist movement. Even if there were exceptional straight women who theoretically understood that one could be utterly fulfilled without the approval of men, without male erotic affirmation, they did not bring to the movement the lived experience of this belief. In the early stages of feminist movement, we used the phrase woman-identified woman or man-identified woman to distinguish between those activists who did not choose lesbianism, but who did choose to be woman-identified, meaning their ontological existence did not depend on male affirmation. Male-identified females were those who dropped feminist principles in a flash if they interfered with romantic heterosexual concerns. They were the females who also supported men more than women, who could always see things from the male perspective. Teaching one of my first women's studies courses in San Francisco, I was confronted by a group of radical lesbian students who wanted to know why I was still into men. After class one day in the parking lot, there was a showdown. At that time, an older black woman lesbian student who had worked in the sex industry, having much sexual intercourse with men even as she remained clear about her lesbian identity, defended my feminist honor by declaring, "She's a woman-identified woman who's into sex with men. That's her right, but she's still down with the cause." Sustaining loyalty to feminist politics was a central topic of discussion within feminist circles by the mid-'80s, as many women were dropping out. Excuse me. Sorry. While visionary lesbian thinkers and or activists had shaped the radical dimensions of the movement as women gained more rights, their presence, their input was often forgotten. Many of the lesbians who were most radical and courageous in the movement were from working class backgrounds. Then they did not have the credentials needed to rise in academic circles. The academization of feminism reinscribed heterosexist hierarchies, where straight women with fancy credentials were often given more respect and higher regard, even if they had spent no time being involved in a women's movement outside the academy. When it came to issues of difference, of expanding feminist theory and practice to include race and class, visionary lesbian thinkers were among those women most willing to change their perspectives. In many cases, it was because they had an experiential understanding of what it means to be exploited and or oppressed because you do not conform to mainstream standards. Visionary lesbians were far more willing to take on the issue of interrogating white supremacy than their straight comrades, and they were more likely to desire to strengthen bonds with all men. The vast majority of straight women, whether they were actively feminist or not, were more concerned about their relationships with men. Our freedom as women to choose who we love, who we will share our bodies and lives with, has been deeply enhanced by the struggles of radical lesbian women, both on behalf of gay rights and women's rights. Within feminist movement, both past and present day, lesbians have always had to challenge and confront homophobia, much in the same way as all women of color, irrespective of their sexual preference or identity, challenged and confronted racism. Women who claim to be feminists while perpetuating homophobia are as misguided and hypocritical as those who want sisterhood while holding on to white supremacist thought. Mainstream mass media has always chosen a straight woman to represent what the feminist movement stands for. The straighter, the better. The more glamorous she is, the more her image can be used to appeal to men. Woman-identified women, whether straight, bisexual, or lesbian, rarely make garnering male approval a priority in our lives. This is why we threaten the patriarchy. Lesbian women who have a patriarchal mindset are far less threatening to men than feminist women, gay or straight, who have turned their gaze and their desire away from the patriarchy, away from sexist men. Nowadays, the vast majority of lesbians, like their straight counterparts, are not into radical politics. Individual lesbian thinkers active in feminist movement often found it difficult to face the reality that lesbian women could be as sexist as straight women. The utopian notion that feminism would be the theory and lesbianism the practice was continually disrupted by the reality that most lesbians living in white supremacist capitalist patriarchal culture constructed partnerships using the same paradigms of domination and submission as did their heterosexual counterparts. And that building mutually satisfying bonds where no one risked being subordinated was as difficult to achieve in lesbian relationships as in heterosexual ones. The revelation that domestic violence happened in lesbian partnerships was the first clue that equality among women was not inherent in same-sex bonds. Concurrently, feminist lesbians were far more willing to talk openly about their participation in sadomasochist sexual acts than their straight counterparts. Sexually conservative feminists, gay and straight, found and continue to find consensual sexual rituals of domination and submission inappropriate and see them as betraying feminist ideals of freedom. Their absolute judgment, their refusal to respect the rights of all women to choose the sexual practice they find most fulfilling, is in actuality the stance which most undermines feminist movement. There are many women who will never understand what two women do together sexually, who will never desire another woman sexually, but who will always support the right of women to choose, to be lesbian or bisexual. That same support can be given lesbians and straight women who engage in sexual acts that would never appeal to most women or most people. Embedded in conservative feminist critique of lesbian sadomasochism was an underlying homophobia. Whenever any woman acts as though lesbians must always follow rigid moral standards to be deemed acceptable or to make straight people feel comfortable, they are perpetuating homophobia. Certainly, as more straight women openly discussed their involvement with sexual sadomasochism, feminist critique was not as harsh and unrelenting as it was when it was seen as mostly a lesbian thing. Challenging homophobia will always be a dimension of feminist movement, for there can be no sustained sisterhood between women when there is ongoing disrespect and subordination of lesbian females by straight women. In visionary feminist movement, the work of activists who are lesbians is fully acknowledged. Without radical lesbian input, feminist theory and practice would never have dared to push against the boundaries of heterosexism to create spaces where women, all women, irrespective of their sexual identity and or preference, could and can be as free as they want to be. This legacy should be continually acknowledged and cherished. All right. Those were chapters 14 through 16 of Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks. I think there's a lot to take away there about that last chapter. Again, about this kind of topic of political lesbianism and 4B movement that has popped up again recently. We have a video essay on this channel, or on the Elliot Sang channel, about 4B movement and its potential problematics as something suggesting that enforcing a type of lifestyle and a type of sexual choice among women is a necessity for a type of feminist politics and a type of feminist political change. At the same time, it is grounded in something that has been a part of feminist movement for a long time. And even aside from disagreements that can be had within feminist movement, you know, as Hooks points out, that lesbianism, the lesbians that were part of the movement from the beginning contributed something that is invaluable, something that is completely necessary to any feminist movement, and its exclusion risks toppling any feminist movement, any feminist politics. So yeah, thank you all for coming by and reading with me, and we will be finishing this book soon. I will let you know when, perhaps before the end of the week, and after which we will choose the next book to start reading. So thanks again, and have a good one. Take care.